Mary and George, which is supposed to be the story of a woman sending her son to influence King James, involve him in a homosexual relationship in order to gain political power. And that's being presented as a true story when it's complete fiction. Here we are again to take a look at it and update in our response to some of the concerns people have expressed. After I read the Steve Costin book, King James Unjustly Accused, I did a great deal of research on my own. I looked up King James in many, many historical books and read a number of biographies of King James. And I was particularly looking for first source information. We have a lot of what I call a Freudian corruption of the imagination. People want to say everything is sexually based. And so they move from that. But the question is, what's the evidence? For example, just recently, the actress Jennifer Lawrence made a statement that Mike Pence was homosexual based on her impression of why he says some of the things against homosexuality that he does. Congresswoman AOC has more than one time said the reason so many conservative critics criticize her positions is because they really want to date her and can't. Again, the Freudian corruption of the imagination. The accusations against King James came out after a fellow named Anthony Weldon, some 25 years after King James' death, a political opponent who'd been removed from position, King James, wrote a book, and even then he didn't suggest that King James was homosexual. He suggested that some of King James's behavior was unusual. A couple other people followed, they picked up with that, they ran it, but even they fall short of suggesting he was homosexual, but they suggested some of his behavior was not just simply not normal. His custom of kissing people in the court, males in the court. As I mentioned last July, Erasmus wrote about this. And he said, when you go to visit the English, he said, you come in, everybody kisses you. You leave, everybody kisses you. It's kisses all the time. And now from Erasmus's culture, that was not normal. And this was simply the Scots culture. It wasn't English culture. And some of the folks in England reacted negatively to it because the Scotch practice it, the French practice it. There's a lot of Scots and French influence in England. And some folks reacted again. But it was everyday normal behavior and appearance. Some folks were very worked up because of the terms of affection that he used. George Villiers, and I've heard his name pronounced both the English way and French way. To be honest, I don't know which one is right. I'm going with George Villiers. George Villiers, some folks pronounce it. He is the person at question in this fictional drama. King James was surrounded by men that were referred to as his favorites. That shouldn't be a surprise. They were called the Order of the Bedchamber. It was their job to spend time with the king. King just didn't do everything himself. If the king wanted a midnight snack, he did not go fix it himself. There was somebody to do it. There was an official number of young men who were on staff. They were paid a salary. Their job was to see to whatever the king needed. They went hunting with the king. They went riding with the king. They served not only as companions for the king, they served as bodyguards. And some folks in talking about King James said, boy, he was so paranoid, always thinking somebody was trying to kill him. His grandfather was assassinated. His father was assassinated. There were 4 actual attempts to kill him that failed, and at least 8 other plots that were uncovered and people were arrested. And that's not being paranoid when they're really trying to kill you. And it was a normal custom for kings. Henry VIII, notorious womanizer, did the same thing, had a huge bed that several people could sleep in. And Henry VIII had bodyguards sleeping on either side of him at night, all night. So did King James. So did King Edward. It was the normal way of providing protection. There were qualifications for being one of the favorites. They were expected to be athletic. They expected to be strong, healthy, handsome young men. That wasn't just for King James. They are part of the appearance of the court. James was close to some of his. He spoke to them in terms that people find funny. He wrote to them. He particularly wrote to George Villiers. And at one point, and a lot of folks said, this is absolute proof of homosexuality. He said that his relationship with Villiers was like the relationship between David and Jonathan. Well, wait a minute, you'd have to believe David and Jonathan were homosexuals before that would be proof, and it's clearly not. And then James said that Villiers was to him like John was to Christ. They say that's absolute proof of homosexuality. It's absolutely not, because John and Christ obviously were not homosexual. That's again the Freudian corruption of the imagination whenever they hear anything like that, see anything like that. But James, with his various favorites, number of letters exist between him and Villiers, and he and Villiers' wife, in which he would use terms like my dog, my monkey, my son, my brother, my husband, my wife. And they were all terms in common usage in England at the time to describe there being a special emotional relationship. And the King James particularly used the term dog. Somebody said, oh, that was a vulgar term. No, dogs were prized. His hunting dogs were prized. His favorites handled and raised and took care of his hunting dogs. And they took them with them. It was a normal term, not unique to him. James used the same terms writing to Villiers' wife. James's son, Charles, would use the same terms writing to Villiers, who he considered his best friend. They grew up going hunting together, doing the same age bracket. The fact you don't understand the terms that they used and use commonly doesn't mean a thing. They routinely called each other darling, which, by the way, they still do in Ireland. Men call men darling. A number of English historians with firsthand knowledge of King James, Bishop Goodman and other folks, wrote books answering all this. They pointed out the things that he is referring to are normal, everyday, common experiences, and the critics were English. And I said many of the English criticized the Scots for this. He was King James of Scotland before he was King James of England. King James was very controversial because of his belief in divine right of kings, that the will of the king was the will of God. He believed that. He talked about it. He wrote about it. Lots of leaders in England publicly disagreed, took him to task. They said, this is wrong. This is not really what the Bible teaches. This is not good for England. But at the same time, his critics were praising him as a godly man who set an example for morality, who fathered children with his wife instead of his mistresses, which was normal and routine for the monarchy. He was a man who taught morality, who wrote about morality, and who practiced morality. Now, could all those folks be fooled? It's not impossible. Sometimes people have pretty amazing secrets. But how can you say his homosexuality was blatant when even his political opponents had to praise him for being a godly example of morality? Do you think they would not have loved to have jumped on the accusation that he was guilty of unnatural crime? There are monarchs who've been labeled as homosexuals. They can go through and say, this happened, these people saw it, or he said this, or this person did this confession, or several people did a confession. And then you got first source evidence you have to look at, you have to analyze. So there's no first source evidence. Again, look at this years ago. I came across folks saying, well, the concept of Victorian morality. Queen Victoria gave a morals lecture every year in England. So she's a complete hypocrite. She had an affair with her coach driver. So how do we know this? So I did everything I could to find out about the affair with the coach driver. This is the evidence. She had a favorite coach driver. When she was going somewhere, she would ask if he could be the one that drove her. And the reason he was her favorite is because when most people were too scared to speak to the monarch, he would collect jokes and tell her jokes every time on the trip. And she thought he was really funny. So I said, well, that's absolute proof of an affair. Really? We'd better hope it's not. Again, the Freudian corruption of the imagination. I doubt seriously if a single one of AOC's critics are criticizing her policies because they really want to date her. I think that exists entirely in her ego. I certainly don't believe Jennifer Lawrence as if she was the great psychologist who could explain to us Mike Pence. So what do we believe with King James? What's the evidence? One of the emphasis in the Bible over and over again is 2 or 3 witnesses. King James ever say this? Absolutely to the contrary. anyone ever say he was my homosexual partner? I was in a relationship with him. No. Even the people who are saying, well, historians have psychologically analyzed this and they've come to this conclusion, qualify their statement saying, but of course, no one knows what goes on behind closed doors. And it's absolutely right. No one knows what went on behind closed doors because, thirdly, no one ever saw him. No one ever said, I saw him commit this homosexual act. It's not that there aren't 2 or 3 witnesses. There is not one witness. I think it's a great injustice to portray someone who gave every indication of being a born-again person, who described the plan of salvation properly, indicated he trusted Christ, to be responsible for unjustly accusing a brother.